Mainstream American psychology operates on a highly specific cultural assumption. We default to the idea that a person's behaviors, their successes, and their psychological failures are entirely self-contained within their independent biology. This individualistic bias forms the absolute core of the traditional medical model. If a patient exhibits symptoms of depression or ADHD, the system diagnoses them in a vacuum, treating the structural symptoms as an internal defect while largely ignoring external variables. When treatment ignores the environment, it often enters a cycle of temporary relief followed by relapse. These persistent long-term failure rates then allow the system to blame the patient's supposed unwillingness to change rather than its own foundational blind spot. When we look at modern fMRI scans of the brain, social neuroscience provides a direct empirical counterargument to this isolated model.
Historically, scientists mapped the human brain as a biological calculator, a cold, logical organ that evolved to execute complex computations and engineer tools. Picture the prefrontal cortex as a standard sheet of paper. The area dedicated strictly to mathematical logic is the size of a single quarter. The entire rest of that sheet is biologically wired to navigate, decode, and map our complex social systems. We see this in what neuroscientists call the default mode network. The exact millisecond you stop actively solving an analytical puzzle, your brain instantly and uncontrollably shifts into processing your relationships and your social standing. Evaluating the mind as an independent entity ignores its primary biological function. The brain is, by design, an interconnected social organ. To treat human beings, we have to adopt a framework that acknowledges this biological reality: situationalism. Situationalism is the scientific recognition that the immediate environment exerts a far more profound impact on behavior than internal traits. Our actions are dictated by the imagined or implied presence of society. When you stop at a red light on a deserted road at 2 a.m, you wait for the green. You behave as if others are watching, even when no one is there. Social psychology proves over and over that changing human output does not require massive ideological persuasion. Minute, highly specific situational adjustments dictate how people act. This reality stands in stark contrast to the traditional medical model's stubborn insistence on treating isolated symptoms with internal medication. You cannot accurately evaluate human psychology, let alone cure its pathologies, without fully mapping the social stage the individual is forced to perform on. We actively resist evaluating the environment because of a cognitive roadblock known as the fundamental attribution error. This pervasive error wires us to constantly overestimate personality variables and underestimate situational forces. We regularly misdiagnose other people's failures as deep-seated character flaws rather than environmental reactions. Consider this split-screen view of a car accident, demonstrating the actor-observer bias. From the driver's view, the crash is caused by the situation. The road was slippery. The other guy ran a light. From the observer's view, the driver's personality is to blame. They are a careless, aggressive person. The driver blames the external situation to protect their ego. The observer bypasses the situation entirely to assign a dispositional label. On a societal scale, this bias is driven by the just world hypothesis, the psychological comfort blanket that the world is inherently fair and predictable. We use this hypothesis to blame victims of mass tragedies for their own misfortune, or to label perpetrators as having highly specific, isolated brain diseases. We project the blame onto an internal defect to avoid facing systemic environmental failures. Our brains actively resist acknowledging the power of the environment, because doing so shatters our comforting illusion of total individual control. We can measure exactly how much control the environment actually has over us by looking at the stereotype threat studies conducted by researchers at UCLA and Stanford. The baseline for the experiment was rigorous. Researchers administered a highly complex IQ-style cognitive test to a group of inner-city Black community college students. To strictly control the environmental variables, the testing occurred in isolated campus buildings on empty Saturdays. This bar chart maps the initial results. In Condition 1, researchers placed white Confederate students in the hallways outside the testing room. Their mere silent presence was the only variable.
That tiny environmental manipulation artificially suppressed the test taker's scores, manufacturing a result that confirmed historical racial performance gaps. Then came condition 2. Researchers tested an identical demographic of inner-city students, but removed the demographic threat entirely. The only other person present in the building was a Black professor. Under this exact same test, but with a different social architecture, the inner-city student scores perfectly matched those of highly selected elite undergraduate students. The deficit vanished as soon as the threat was removed. This demonstrates that what looked like a fixed biological trait was actually a temporary symptom of a hostile social architecture. To understand exactly why the environment exercises such absolute control over our biology, we look to social identity theory. This structural diagram of belonging breaks it down. For a human to achieve a sense of connection, they require specific cognitive and affective motives, shared meaning, predictability, and trusting relationships. This is a strict biological necessity. World War II data revealed that when completely isolated from human contact, a person's body initiates a physiological shutdown. Even with premium food, clean water, and perfect physical shelter, they die under the exact same biological markers as starvation. We see the legal consequences of denying this connection in the historical tragedy of pioneering entertainer Bert Williams. He possessed immense internal genius, starring in the Ziegfeld Follies and becoming the first Black recording star in history. Yet the external societal mandate of the early 20th century dictated that he could only achieve that success by performing in degrading, exaggerated minstrel makeup. Society systematically denied him the right to simply exist as himself. The psychological trauma generated by that identity conflict was absolute. Despite his immense wealth, Williams lived a profoundly isolated life, retreating to his library, relying on alcohol to cope with extreme depression, and collapsing on stage to die at the age of 47. No amount of individual wealth, disposition, or fame can protect a mind from systemic deterioration when its environment actively rejects its social identity. The historical trauma of identity denial maps directly onto modern clinical outcomes, specifically the modern epidemic of loneliness. This chart measures mean social loneliness. The data reveals a massive spike in extreme emotional and social isolation the moment an individual's social identity is stripped away. Profound isolation actively warps a person's structural perception of reality. As people become progressively lonelier, their perceived value of material possessions spikes, and they begin anthropomorphizing objects to fill the social void. Left untreated, this isolation escalates to severe clinical outcomes. To understand how, we have to define the difference between self-harm behaviors and suicidal ideation. Self-harm is an attempt to relieve suffering through the infliction of physical pain. Suicide, however, is an attempt to end suffering permanently, driven by a primary sense of absolute helplessness. Researchers Ammerman and Jacobucci found that lethal suicidal ideation is the specific result of combining clinical depression with profound loneliness. The shift from a treatable mood disorder to a lethal mental health crisis is almost always triggered by this structural failure to belong. The burden of isolation expands beyond the individual. It ripples outward, straining family structures, draining community resources, and costing the global economy over $1 trillion in lost productivity every year. We can trace this in the cycle of addiction diagram, which highlights a secondary pathology born directly from environmental destabilization. The psychological roots of dependency are tied intimately to these emotional triggers. To address this, we must reject the dangerous cultural myth of the lone wolf. The toxic idolization of absolute self-reliance runs counter to human biology. The final empirical finding is clear. Implementing strategic social connection decreases depression, anxiety, and trauma symptoms at a higher rate than traditional isolated self-care strategies or standalone medication. The future of mental wellness requires abandoning the individualistic bias. To save the mind, we must stop medicating it in a vacuum and start repairing the fractured social architecture it relies on to survive.